This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What in the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on?
I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
What the hell's the matter with these guys?
We don't know what's going on.
What the hell's going on?
Who in God's name knows what it's all about?
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, the world appears to be falling apart. What's the latest?
Well, Americans woke up to see that there was martial law in South Korea, and then by the time they went to bed, the martial law had ended. It was the shortest military coup in modern history. Most of our listeners, I assume, do not spend a lot of time studying South Korean politics, and their most recent memory of the South Korean president, if they paid any attention at all, was hearing him saying, "Bye-bye, Miss America Pie," at the White House at a state dinner the other night. In fact, let's play a little piece of the musical talents of the South Korean president.
A long, long time ago, I can still remember how that music used to make me smile. And now I knew if I had my chains that I could make those people dance, and maybe they'd be happy for a while.
So those are the musical stylings of the president of South Korea. Danny, he went from singing "Bye-bye, Miss America Pie" to declaring the world's shortest martial law. What the hell?
This was political malpractice of the worst order. And it's one thing if you are a guy who's got your own party in power and you control the president's house, in Korea it's the Blue House, and you control the legislature and you control the press and everybody's favorable. That's not the way it is. This is more like Donald Trump and the media is controlled by the far left and Congress is controlled by the Democratic Party, and he decides to do, well,
actually, you're describing the reality.
Wait, that wasn't a good analogy at all.
Danny.
That wasn't a good analogy at all. Nah, look, he had so little appreciation of the weakness of his own position. And look, for me and for everybody listening, everybody's going to be like, oh my God, what do I care about South Korea? And the answer is, guys, you are going to care because this has implications for us vis-a-vis China. This has implications for us in the Pacific. This has implications for us in Japan. This has implications for us against North Korea. This has nuclear implications. This has opened up a Pandora's box at a moment when we could least afford it.
So one of the goals of our podcast here is to give you a idiot's guide to some of these really complicated issues by bringing in really smart people who understand them. And in this case, Danny and I pretend to be experts on things that we're not experts on, but we're really not South Korea experts. And what we decided to do is for those who are just wondering what the hell is going on in South Korea, to have one of our great colleagues at AEI come in, Zack Cooper, who is just there and is on his way making his way back across the Pacific and got up early in the morning at his rest stop in Hawaii to talk to us coming back from the region. And so I think rather than us talking about this, I think let's just go to the idiot's guide. Let's get Zack to come on and talk to us and just explain what the hell is going on. You woke up, you read this stuff in the paper, you saw it on the news, and you're wondering what is going on there. He's going to explain it to us in real simple terms that even Danny and I can understand.
There you go, especially Mark. Zack Cooper. Zack Cooper is a senior fellow at that excellent institution, the American Enterprise Institute. He studies U.S. strategy in Asia, alliance dynamics, and U.S.-China competition. He also teaches at Princeton University and serves as chair of the board of the Open Technology Fund. He previously served as the assistant to the Deputy National Security Advisor for combating terrorism at the National Security Council and as a special assistant to the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at DoD. More importantly, his upcoming book, I'm really excited about, Tides of Fortune, The Rise and Decline of Great Militaries, is out next year from Yale University Press.
Here's our interview. Zach, welcome back to the podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks, guys.
So, what the hell is happening in South Korea?
That is what I am asking too. Boy, what a crazy 24 hours. So the short version is that the South Korean president, Yoon Suk Yeol, tried to announce martial law, which has a terrible history going back to 1979 when this was last attempted. And the end result, I think, is that Yoon and maybe the conservatives will get tossed out of power one way or the other. So he may get impeached. He may resign, but either way, he's basically dead in the water. And we can go into the implications of all this, for the US, but I'll just say it's bad. It's terrible. It couldn't be worse from an American perspective.
You were just there with the special operations forces who were charged with carrying out this. Could we call it a coup? Talk about that.
Well, so there is a legal mechanism which Yoon Suk Yeol used, which is that you can declare martial law, and then the National Assembly, which is the Korean parliament, can essentially vote, which they did, to reject that declaration. But it appears that Yoon tried to use military forces to prevent the National Assembly from getting there to have the vote. And that looks a lot like a palace coup. Bottom line, it didn't happen. And I think the ROK military broadly was probably against this idea. It doesn't sound like a lot of people were consulted beforehand. But I think everybody is just in shock in Seoul right now. And the implications of this are going to be widespread for years, if not decades, not just in Korea, but in the region.
So let's talk about the backstory because I think, again, Korea, the intricacies of the Korean government are not clear to most people, and certainly not to me and Mark. So we have a prime minister from one party and the legislature, which voted him down unanimously, from another party. But what's the casus belli here? How did Yoon get to the point that he felt it necessary to declare martial law? I know what he said, right? He said people are trying to destroy the republic and North Korea, blah, blah, blah. But what he said was almost incoherent. What is the real reason he did this, and what's been the problem?
So I wouldn't say that people expected that he would declare martial law. There had been some, including General Tonenbom, who's really well known in the United States, who'd written a piece even a few months ago saying that this was under discussion, but that he didn't think it was going to happen. But really where this all began is the Korean president has a 5-year term. And Yoon Suk Yeol was barely elected, a razor thin margin when he won his term. Almost immediately, things started to go bad. This is not a guy who's been a career politician. He's not particularly good at politics. He was a prosecutor. And the progressives in Korea have been attacking him left and right and very successfully. So his approval rating has been dropping rapidly down into the 20s. And there has been legislation that he was trying to get through, especially on spending, and that basically failed over the last week. I just don't understand then why Yoon chose the nuclear option, which has basically destroyed not the progressives as he was hoping, but actually his own conservative party. It is really hard to know.
So I had to leap in here because the way you just described it reminded me so forcibly of former Majority Leader Bob Dole. He ran against Bill Clinton, and Bob Dole was a very famously acerbic, mean, but mildly hilarious guy. And obviously he lost. And at that point he commented, "They told me to go for the jugular. Unfortunately, I went for my own." And I think that is so apt for what Yoon did. So even more sort of South Korea, Republic of Korea for idiots, help us understand what the difference between the two parties. Because, we have a bunch of people at AEI who've done amazing work on Korea. You, Nick Eberstadt, Dan Blumenthal, and others. And, one party there's a big difference, let me say it that way, just to help people understand so that they can get what the fight between the president and the legislature was really about.
Yeah, so part of what's tough about Korean politics is that The divisions are so nasty in Korea between the progressives and the conservatives. And, for the most part, if you're a Korean leader, after you leave office, you end up in jail now. It's not a great place to be. And you get huge public protests pretty frequently against whoever happens to be in power. And so almost every recent Korean government has basically collapsed or struggled over the finish line. Yoon had been in real trouble. He, for a lot of Americans, is actually a pretty great fit. He's very pro-American. He tried to make up with Japan and made a lot of progress on that. He was fairly anti-China, anti-North Korea, and I would say, a lot of progressives are not. There were fights over foreign policy. There were also just a huge number of fights over domestic issues. And that's kind of where things broke down last week about spending priorities. And the National Assembly, the parliament, is controlled by the progressives. And so they basically have been blocking everything Yoon wants to do. I think that's why Yoon got so frustrated. But then to go and try and declare martial law, that step, what was going on in his head, and what it sounds like are two or three people that he consulted about this. I don't think anyone really understands that yet.
Talk about the political divisions in South Korea, because my understanding is this is not like, I mean, we all sit here. First of all, what you described sounds like where we're headed in America. So
Exactly.
we can
Yay.
get into that discussion in a moment. Where every president leaves and they get indicted and they go to jail, and then the next president leaves and they get indicted and they go to jail. So we can get into the modeling that they're doing for is this a window into the future of America? But just talk to us first a little bit more about Korea. We here in the United States think, oh, the Democratic Party has gone really far left. How far left is the left in Korea? and what would the implications of the implosion of the pro-American right in Korea mean for American interests in the region?
Yeah, I mean, just to focus on foreign policy for the minute, because I think that's where the implications are the biggest. Look, so the progressives, what they really want in Korea is to make up with the North. Now, I'm not sure that Kim Jong-un has any interest whatsoever in doing this. He just over the last few months has been blowing up the shared facilities that North Korea and South Korea have. So it's not like he's looking for unification tomorrow. But that is the core foreign policy difference, or, in some ways a domestic difference, right, between the left and the right, which is that the left in Korea really genuinely wants to fix things with the North, and they think it's possible, despite the fact that, going back what it is, 80 years now, relations between North and South haven't been particularly great. So I think that's where we're going to see the immediate shifts. But it's beyond that, right? Yoon Suk Yeol wanted to make Korea into what he called a global pivotal state. So they've been helping Ukraine. They've been deepening ties with Europe. They've been improving ties with Japan, all at the expense of the relationships with North Korea, with China, with Russia. I think the progressives are going to come in and try and reverse a lot of that momentum.
See that? I mean, that's the thing. As usual, Zach, because you're so nice, you don't say the terrible things that I'm about to say, which is that the
Kenny,
left
who's
is
not nice.
right. The left in Korea, if you think about North Korea, you are talking about the most totalitarian state in the world. You are talking about a people who are starved, they are oppressed, they are press ganged. No one has a car, people have bikes, people don't have enough food, people are forced labor left, right, and center. We are talking about a terrible, terrible place. And yet the left in South Korea not only wants to reunify, but maybe wants to reunify more on their model than on ours. That's number one. Number two, in its last tenure in power, systematically dismantled protections for defectors from North Korea, something that should be a sacred obligation on the part of the South to take in their countrymen, instead went about trying to ensure that people couldn't come in, and if they did come in, that they would be isolated, ostracized. These are, forgive me for talking your issues, but these are terrible people. They hate us and they love Kim Il Sungism. It's just incredible. And I think the implications for us are just really, really bad news. Talk about the Ukraine.
So he was right to declare martial law, Danny.
I wouldn't go that far.
They're North Korean agents infiltrating the Korean democracy and threatening our great alliance. You've just made the case for the martial law. I'm on board.
You gotta know you gotta know your limitations, Mark, is all I can say. But Zack, a reversal doesn't just mean a change back toward pro-North policy. It also means an end to all of this. What does it mean? We've got, how many troops do we now have in South Korea?
Wow, that's a good question. So theoretically, they're 28,500. I think we're actually quite a bit lower than that. But still, that's a lot of folks. And and I mean, I think troop numbers are the first thing I thought about when this all happened, because the South Koreans knew that they needed to build a relationship with Trump right after he won. They initially hoped to go to Mar-a-Lago or Trump Tower and see him there, but the Trump team said, "Look, we've got this Logan Act. I don't really want to have foreign leaders coming to see me." So they delayed. But Yoon Suk-yeol was perfectly positioned to get along with Trump. Conservative guy. He speaks English. You might remember he did this state visit, and at the White House, he actually sang American Pie in English. He's a likable guy. And I'd been talking a lot with the Korean government about saying, look, Donald Trump, I'm going to be your best friend. You had this terrible progressive guy, Moon Jae-in, last time. Now you've got a strong conservative leader. I'm going to stand shoulder to shoulder with you, and we can do great things together. I think Yoon Suk-yeol could have done that. And now you either have him stumbling across the finish line, and I don't think people are going to want to touch him with a 10-foot pole, or you're going to get a progressive coming in who's going to want to reverse all of this stuff that Yoon has done. The result, I think, is that you probably have a real push by Trump to rethink whether we should pull troops off the peninsula again, which I think the South Korean government had thought about a lot and probably would have been able to forestall. I think it's back on the table now.
Would that be disastrous? I mean, so how many years is it since the Korean War? Do we really need? We're right now. I mean, obviously, it's different because you have the DMZ and the North Korean threat is real. But first of all, we're going to find out what a little bit about, and I want to get into this a little later with you in the pod. We're going to find out a little bit about the capabilities of the North Korean military, because I assume they just sent some of their best troops to Kursk. So we'll see how they do against the Ukrainians. But do we need 30,000 American troops as a tripwire in the DMZ? Could the South Koreans defend the DMZ in their own country without us being there?
Yeah, I guess I'd say two things about that, Mark. And the first is, look, the South Koreans have a very capable military, right? So we should acknowledge that right off the top. The reality, though, is that the North Koreans have all of Seoul within artillery range,
Yeah.
which means a huge portion of the South Korean population is undefendable. Right? There's something like 6,000 or 7,000 North Korean artillery tubes within range of Seoul, and we're not going to take all of those out immediately. So if a war starts, South Korea's capital and a huge portion of this population is at great risk.
Can I just interrupt you there for a question?
Yeah, of course.
And we're assuming this is South Korea for idiots. How is that different from the situation in Israel? And why couldn't an Iron Dome help defend? Are we now technologically still incapable of defending Seoul? If you preemptively took out a lot of those rockets, and so assuming it was a smaller, is there any way to defend Seoul, or is that truly like a permanent reality of Seoul?
So the Koreans have been really interested in that idea. Could you go after the artillery launchers, almost immediately go after the missile launchers and the artillery sites and combine that with missile defense? The reality is, I don't think they're anywhere close to being able to do that now, even though they'd like to be able to do that in the future. So I think that vulnerability stays. But here's the bigger concern that I have. So we have North Korea doing a pretty rapid nuclear buildup. We've got the Chinese doing a very rapid nuclear buildup. We've got the Russians making nuclear threats. The only South Korean response to that is the strength of the US-South Korea alliance and the extended deterrent that the US provides, which relies on our tripwire forces. Now, maybe we don't need 28,500 troops in Korea to reassure the South Koreans of that tripwire. I don't know what the number is that we would need, but I think that's where the first question is, how many troops do we need to have a reliable tripwire to convince the South Koreans that we're going to be there and convince the North Koreans not to mess with us? And then second, are the South Koreans capable of fighting primarily a conventional battle on their own? And I'm not sure of the answer to that last question. I think they may not be yet.
How can that be after all these years?
Well, Mark, when we were in government, you may have been involved in this. We had this big debate about whether to transition operational control of forces
Yep,
from the
I
U.S.
remember that.
military to Korea, right? Back and forth. I remember being in the Pentagon and like this got nasty. And we have a conditions-based transfer plan now. And the idea is that we'll transfer that operational control to the Koreans when they're ready. If you look at most of those conditions, we don't think the Koreans are ready. And so I think this is the risk.
Yeah, but Mark,
No
you
problem.
express you no, no, come on. You express shock. Let me tell you, we have seen a whole bunch of our allied militaries in operations over the last few years. I'm assuming you remember what happened in Libya when Barack Obama went
Mm-hmm.
in because our friends the Brits ran
Concrete
out of
bomb.
ammo. Right, our friends the French didn't have any bombs. They together don't have any lift. The Germans don't have any bombs, although they have lift. The Russian military, supposed to take Kyiv within 3 days, is still fighting and losing tens of thousands of soldiers. The Saudis got the carte blanche. The Saudis, who we have been working with for decades, got carte blanche to go into Yemen, where they promptly bombed a bunch of school buses by mistake, where their soldiers were too fat to run across the border. I mean, let me tell you something. When you look at this, the only silver lining here not to speak of the Afghan forces and the Iraqi forces, and the Syrian forces and the Lebanese forces, which is stuff I know. So the only forces that actually are capable of doing anything are the Israelis and us. That's number one. And number two, there's a silver lining here, which is that we actually do remain the indispensable nation. Sorry for that little side rant, but no bad on South Korea. Look, this is how it is, and no surprise, but we don't have an interest in seeing another war in Korea. Zach, talk about what the implications are for the collapse of this Japan, America, Korea incipient alliance, about what it looks like in Asia vis-a-vis China.
Yeah, so I think it's just a disaster from this perspective as well. So the short version is, look, the US has been making real progress. I think this is true under both Biden and Trump, with a bunch of countries in Asia that the Chinese have pushed too hard. And Korea is one of them, right? So with South Korea, with Japan, with the Philippines, with Australia, with India, there's been a lot of progress recently. But now this seems to be fracturing a little bit. We've got the mess in South Korea. We haven't even talked about this. In the Philippines, the vice president has publicly threatened to kill the president and is now on the verge of prosecution. So that's not great. And so I think you're starting to see some of our longstanding treaty alliances sort of fracture a little bit under these domestic political pressures. And the worry I have is that we're going to end up with really weakened sets of alliances. And, this coming together of Korea, Japan, for example, I think that's going to go backwards immediately. Why? Because the progressives want to undo everything that Yoon did. And arguably the biggest and best thing he did was the Japan relationship.
Right. But, you noted it's not right. What's happening in the Philippines is disastrous. What's happening in Korea is disastrous. What's happening in Australia is disastrous. We don't talk about that very often, but the Albanese government has basically decided that, Justin Trudeau is their model. He's just a little bit too conservative for them. Jacinda Ardern is the really kind of great model for them. And we're seeing this in anti-Americanism, anti-Israel, anti-alliance behavior. I mean, and then our allies in Europe are just unbelievably feckless. I mean, we're looking at a period of democratic collapse.
Here's the crazy thing. I did not think I would be saying this, but
Yeah.
Donald Trump is emerging at basically a time when the United States is completely unchallenged in terms of leadership of the democratic world, despite all the talk about how somebody else was going to step up. Like French and the Germans barely have governments. Korea, Japan are in the same spot. Canada, Australia have governments that look like they're going to lose elections soon. Like Donald Trump is basically the only guy with a stable political situation among the advanced industrial democracies. It's pretty shocking.
So I want to go back to this point that Danny was making because I'm just looking here on online, and the South Koreans were between 1960 and 2022 were spending an average of 3.92% of GDP on defense. In 2022, they were at 2.72, which was a decline from 2.81. If you have a million North Korean troops on your border, you better be spending more than 2.71% of GDP on defense. You've got the Taiwanese who were spending about 2% of GDP on defense. It's now up to 2.5%. I'm sorry, you're in an existential threat from a totalitarian regime that has declared its intention to destroy your country and take you over. That's just unacceptable. In terms of if you look at what the polls have done since the Ukrainian invasion, they were spending 2.5% of GDP on defense before the Ukraine invasion, which was the most in NATO. And they have since doubled that. They're going to be at 5% of GDP. They're going to have the second largest military in Europe. And they've done this in a matter of a few years. They're buying everything that they possibly can because they recognize, despite having an Article 5 commitment in NATO, that relying on other people to defend you is not really a smart way. Even if you got that security guarantee, you still need to be able to defend yourself. I think Donald Trump has a point about free riding of these countries, and particularly countries. It's one thing for Germany, which no longer has millions of Soviet forces on its border, to be having 70% of its planes inoperable, as they did when Trump came into office. And I can give you the statistics. I don't have them in front of me, but I've written about them. It's entirely another for a frontline state to not be carrying its own weight and depending on 30,000 American troops to be your tripwire to protect you. Maybe you need to take away a little bit of the security blanket in order to get these countries to take their own defense seriously. Am I wrong?
I guess so. I completely agree that our allies, most of them, should be doing more. I guess the question, and this may get tested, right, is how to get them to do more, and whether when you pull away a bit of the security blanket, whether they step up or they step back. And I think some of them may actually step back. Like my concern with the Korean progressives is that if the US steps back a little bit, they may say, like, yeah, we never liked the US anyways. Let's go make friends with the Chinese and the North Koreans and see if we can kind of, realign ourselves. So I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I do think that's kind of the risk. So I think that'll be the big debate now, and not just Korea, obviously, but some parts of Europe too.
No, look, I mean, the problem is not simply investment, though, Mark. You can't criticize, for example, the Saudis on their investment in their military, and yet performance is a big issue. You can't criticize the Russians for their investment in their military, but a lot has to do with the capability of performance. And oftentimes, having us there does fill some of the needed cultural holes in these militaries that can make them effective.
Or it's a crutch.
Well, again, you can think that way, and I guess the question is, do we have an interest? Do we have an interest in the stability of these countries? And for me, of course, the answer is yes, we do. But Zack, can I ask you? I want to come back to my hobby horse. We had this great interchange on our little foreign and defense policy listserv, and you talked about a lot of the issues that you've laid out with us today. And then Nick, our own Nick Eberstadt, on total rantomatic, very enjoyable rantomatic, laid out what exactly we're looking at in terms of the other side in Korea. And he said, so first, the leader of the opposition, Lee Jae-myung, was about to be indicted on corruption charges and now probably won't be. And Nick says he appears to have secretly funneled $8 million to North Korea, and then editorialized, why? You know why. This will be a get out of jail free card for him, says Nick. then, of course, the lawfare will continue. He says that the South Korean left is going to be like the leftist Minju Party, which this week opposed a bill making it illegal to spy for China. That was Nick's additional detail. And, I ask myself what the inevitable end of this is if that is the left. Do we see the right recovering from this ever in the near term?
Oh yeah. It, you know, 5 years from now, the right will be strong again because Korean public is never supportive of one party for more than one administration. So the progressives will get their chance to screw stuff up and then people will hate them and the conservatives will win next time. But I think in the meantime, the danger is that Donald Trump hated the last progressive Korean president, Moon Jae-in. He's going to also hate the next Korean progressive. And in fact, I think Trump felt like it was easier to deal with Kim Jong-un than it was to deal with Moon Jae-in. And I think we may be back there, right? In a place where the US is trying to negotiate with the North Koreans, having a harder time dealing with the South Koreans than they are dealing with the North. Like that's the picture here, which I think should make us all pretty worried.
Let's talk a little bit about Kursk. So, we were talking a little bit about our shared time in the Pentagon. I remember talking with Rumsfeld back then, and he was saying you can't do military planning on this basis, but it's entirely possible that, he pointed out that the North Koreans had lowered the height requirement for the North Korean military for military service, and that people were starving. It's entirely possible that the North Korean military is in many ways a paper tiger, that they wouldn't be able to fight their way out of a paper bag. I assume they've sent. Talk to us about the troops that they've sent to Kursk to help Putin. Are these their best troops? And are we going to see what will the Kursk operation give us as far as an insight into North Korea's military capability vis-a-vis the South?
So I don't think we know yet the quality of the North Korean troops, but I suspect it doesn't matter because they're going to die either way on the battlefield, right? I mean, the loss rate, as you guys know better than I do in Ukraine, is just terrible. And the reality is that I don't think the North Koreans are really trying to be able to fight South Korea or the US, in terms of quality. Their threat is that they can destroy Seoul with artillery, and now they've got nuclear weapons and they can use those. And oh, by the way, now because of the new deal they've got with the Russians, maybe the Russians would even come help North Korea if they were in a fight with the South. So I think for North Korea, they're not trying to really make a lot of progress in Kursk. This is just about getting the Russians on the hook to do whatever North Korea needs when the balloon goes up. So, reportedly there are South Koreans trying to observe pretty carefully how the North Koreans are fighting in Kursk, which I think would be wise for us to do as well. But my guess is they're going to have a pretty hard time on the battlefield, and the Russians are just going to use their bodies to throw them against the Ukrainians for the next couple of months.
Okay, exit question for me, and everybody should know you got up at 6 a.m. because you're in Hawaii
It's
on
a
a
really tough
business
life
trip.
here.
I need to be on the AEI employment plan that you are on, Zach, because I'm not waking up at 6 a.m. in Hawaii with a lei around my neck, sipping a pina colada and working for AEI. I go, oh, there it is. For folks who unfortunately we don't do video, but he's got a lei. He's got a lei.
He's got a leg. There you go.
But where's the fruity drink?
That's true. Yeah,
Unfortunately.
it's only coffee.
It's 6 a.m., but if we got him at 6 p.m., there'd be a fruity drink there for sure. I have confidence in my Zack. Exit question
I want
me.
to run the AEI office in Honolulu.
Yeah, there you go.
Good luck with that, Mark. I'll take it up with Corey.
We
But
can do the
Zack,
pod from there.
but we digress. Zack, exit question from me. What happens when and if we pull our troops out of South Korea? What does the future look like? Paint it, but look in your crystal ball and tell us what the potential future looks like.
So I'll give you one potential future. I don't think we're going from 28,500 to zero. I think we're talking about pulling a couple of brigades out probably if Trump gets his way this time, which I would think he will. I think the debate in South Korea will be about whether South Korea needs its own nuclear capability. or at least to have forward deployed US nuclear weapons permanently stationed on the peninsula, perhaps with some nuclear sharing arrangement with South Korea. So the decrease in the conventional capabilities of the US on the peninsula could lead the South Koreans to do what Mark is saying and spend a bit more on their military, but also to think about nuclear options in a new way. Because they just live in a bad world, right? They're surrounded by the Russians, Chinese, and North Koreans all using nuclear options more than they have in the past. And so I think that's one of the first things that folks in Seoul will be thinking about.
So let me follow up on that. Do you think that's a good idea?
Boy, that's a tough question, Mark. I I think it is in some ways unnatural for South Korea not to have nuclear weapons when the North and the Chinese and the Russians have
Yeah.
them if they don't feel confident in the US relationship. And so I think if Donald Trump gets an offer from the South Koreans that is, hey, you can, like, basically asking the US to stay in, and Trump pulls forces off and the South Koreans say, fine, well, we'll build nuclear weapons. I think that might be a deal that Trump makes.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, I just have a column in the Post this week on the Budapest Memorandum, where the Ukraine at the end of the Cold War was the third largest nuclear power in the world. They had 2,000 nuclear ICBMs and strategic bombers, and they gave it all up in exchange for security guarantees from the U.S. If they had not given up those weapons, Russia would not be in their country right now. Isn't the lesson for Japan, for Korea, for Saudi Arabia, for some of these countries around there, and also for the bad guys like Iran, got to get nuclear weapons? It's the only way to guarantee your sovereignty.
So I have a project on this next year, looking
Excellent.
at basically what South Korea, Japan, and maybe even Australia, Danny, might do on the nuclear front. And I think the danger is that you get a proliferation chain. The South Koreans go first because the relationship with Trump will be bad. The Japanese will want to keep up with the South Koreans, and they'll also be worried about the US commitment. The Aussies won't want to be the third leg after South Korea and Japan in terms of their own nuclear assurances. So I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I think this is something we should be talking about a lot more, because I think you're right. If the feeling is that the US is sort of a less reliable protector, then the logic of getting their own nuclear weapons in a world where other countries are already proliferating and building up their stockpiles, I think it's just kind of the logical next question to ask.
And then my real exit question. So one of Trump's top achievements, I think, as president when his first term was withdrawing from the INF Treaty. And that it was seen as by some people, it wasn't so much a North Atlantic move as a Pacific move. I think Admiral Stavridis said that something like 70% of China's missiles would have violated the INF Treaty if they had been a party to it. Have we taken advantage of that in terms of deploying conventional intermediate range missiles in Guam, in Japan, and other places that can be deployed for either a Korean or a Taiwan contingency? And if not, and also should we consider nuclear intermediate range missiles in the Pacific? And what has been done, and what would you recommend doing with the opening that the INF Treaty withdrawal has given?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right that INF was outdated and constraining us in the Pacific in ways that were really damaging. There has been some progress in trying to forward deploy some of these types of capabilities, but the reality is it's taking a while for them to come online. So I think where we should be focused is conventional capabilities that would have violated the INF treaty that give us longer range ability, especially to hit China. Now, the question is, where do those go? Are they, Army or Marine Corps units? There's a lot of issues that still need to be worked through. I wish I could say that I thought we were making progress as fast as we should be, but to be honest, I think it's been far too slow. And so hopefully when the Trump team comes in, this is one thing that they could come in and say, look, we started down this pathway and now we're going to finish it.
Okay, we're never having Zack back because he has nothing but bad news and makes me feel depressed about the future. So you're dead to me, Zack Cooper. Nah, seriously, thank you. You were amazing.
We'll talk Taiwan next time. It'll be really happy, Danny.
Oh, yeah. Cannot wait.
We actually have to, let's invite you preemptively for that podcast, because we need to have that early in the Trump years. What the hell is going to go on in Taiwan under the Trump administration?
Yep, something to look forward to. Can't wait. I'll get my Prozac for that one. Zack, safe travels. Happy holidays. Thank you so much for being with us.
Enjoy Christmas in Hawaii. I feel very bad for you.
I'll be back in DC on Friday, guys. But thank you,
Oh.
Danny. Thank you, Mark.
Mark
Well,
is just making fun.
for the record, we're recording this on, what is it, Wednesday today? You still got some time.
That's true.
Knock yourself out. Have fun. Forget work.
I'm off to the beach.
Take
there
care.
you go.
Okay, Danny. So we got into a little bit of verbal fisticuffs there over taking our hand off the bicycle seat with some of these countries. I'm just appalled at how countries like Taiwan and South Korea, who are so under threat, are doing so little on their own defense and are being so dependent on the United States. I think we have a national interest in helping them. And I think that we have an interest in those countries not being overrun by communist totalitarian regimes. But I also think they need to be doing much more in their own defense. And one of the things that Donald Trump succeeded in doing, and everyone said, oh my God, it's so terrible that Donald Trump said we won't honor your Article 5 commitment in NATO. And he's basically what he said was, if you don't spend what you committed to spend, no, I won't defend you. And guess what? They increased defense spending by $400 billion, and NATO is now stronger than it's ever been as a result of that. I think we need a little bit of that tough love in Korea. I think we need a little bit of that tough love in Taiwan. I think these people need to stop feeling so confident in the American security guarantee that they don't carry their own weight in defending themselves and depend on the American people. Because you know what? Political ties change here, and there might not be political will to defend them. And that's a bad thing. And part of that will saps because Americans perceive, if you look at that Reagan Institute poll, that when it came to NATO, Americans were much more willing to defend NATO allies that were meeting their defense requirements, but when they found out that they weren't, the support dropped dramatically. So if you want to have America playing that deterrent role, those countries have to carry their weight. How do we get them to do it?
Well, first, let me attack the premise here, and let me
Really?
use the words of Donald J. Trump. What works is not to have our allies be so strong that they can fight maybe for an extra week. What works is peace through strength. And the reality is that it is deterrence that stops the North Koreas, the Chinas, the Putins, the others from adventurism. And so, yes, of course, you are totally right that countries should be responsible for their own defense. You are completely right that the reliance on the U.S. umbrella, while at the same time, I should add, abusing the crap out of the United States at every turn and our priorities, that is wrong and that countries should absolutely be responsible. At the same time, I think we need to understand that over the last 70, 80 years, the security of the world and the prosperity of the American people, let's forget about Koreans, right? The prosperity of the American people has rested on the notion that there are not multiple terrible wars going on between South Korea and North Korea, between China and Taiwan, between Israel and Iran, between Russia and Ukraine, because that has implications for us. And while you are completely right that countries should not be freeloaders, I particularly think actually less of the South Koreans in this regard, as they do spend a good deal and do invest in their army. But the Taiwanese, who are truly have been deficient in the years past at building their economy and not tithing away enough for their national defense. But the second that we say, hey, you do it, right? We end up in a place where the Chinese encourage the North Koreans to retake the South Korean peninsula. They won't win, but there'll be a lot of people that die, and it will be very bad for us.
Yeah, so you will find no greater defender of the Pax Americana of the last 70 years than me. I agree with you 100%. And it benefits, we do it not just because it benefits these other countries, but because it benefits us. Because in an era of global trade, we saw all the disruptions that happened from the COVID pandemic. Imagine if a war was raging with China and what the disruptions to our economy and our way of life would be. Even if we weren't involved in the war, it would be disastrous. So I'm not saying that we should abandon these countries and say you're on your own. But if you look at Poland and its response to the Ukraine invasion and how it's doubled its defense spending, I mean, Poland is getting to the point, building a military which even if we did not come to Poland's defense, they would be able to beat Russia. You know,
Like they did last time, you mean?
when they saved Europe in the Battle of Warsaw? Yeah. I mean,
Saved Europe by holding off the Nazis for weeks? Excuse me.
No,
You
I'm
know.
talking about the Soviets, the Bolsheviks in 1919. But anyway, enough about that. The point being is that the Polish military is going to be the third largest military in Europe behind us and Turkey. They're much more powerful military than France, much more powerful military than Germany, much more powerful military than Britain without the nuclear deterrent. That's what the standard should be for a country that is on a front line. 5% of GDP should be the floor for what you're spending on your defense. When I interviewed Trump in Mar-a-Lago and I told him that the Taiwanese were spending about 2.5% of GDP and that I thought they ought to go up to 5%, he said it should be 10. And he's right. These are not poor countries. Taiwan is an incredibly wealthy country. South Korea is an incredibly wealthy country. They can afford to spend more money on their defense. And so I think there's a balance to be made between where you pull. I think we need to wake them up and say, if you don't spend a certain amount of money on your GDP, then no, we're not going to defend you. Because that's what it takes. They should be doing it of their own interest, but without that threat. But the fact is, it seems to be that only those kinds of warnings are the ones that help them get their act together.
Yes, I remember where warnings like that ended in 1914 and I, for one, am not a big fan of abandoning people who we have been with for years and
Nobody's
allowing
talking
them
about
to be
abandoning
taken
them.
over.
We're talking about getting them to spend more money. And again,
And if they don't, then what? Then abandon them?
They need to spend more money.
And if they don't, then abandon them?
We do what's in our national interest, and I think. But again, I'm telling you, Danny, we can go around in circles on this. You just look at if you want the American people, to support coming to the defense of our European allies, which they do, but only if they're meeting their NATO requirements. That is the clear. If you just look at that Reagan Institute poll, that is the clear view of the American people. They support NATO. They think it's important for us to come to a NATO allies' defense, but only if they're paying their fair share. And the American people are right, and you are wrong.
I think you're making a very dangerous argument, and I disagree with you completely. And on that note of disharmony, let us say thank you, everybody, for being here with us to listen to me and Mark argue about the future of our alliances. Let us know what you think, and take care.
Take care. See you next week. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.